If Cuba's regime faces collapse, China is confronted with a critical decision. It must either evacuate its intelligence assets from 4 signal intelligence facilities before U.S. forces arrive, or implement scorched-earth protocols, destroying everything. Meanwhile, Washington is actively preparing teams to recover intact databases, collection logs spanning years, communications archives, and technical specifications. Beijing, in turn, calculates its Y-20 airlift capacity, determining the number of sorties and days required before American troops potentially breach the perimeter at Bajukal. Moscow, for its part, strategically deploys nuclear submarines, signaling that Russian interests persist even when its direct leverage may be limited. Cuban military commanders, caught in the middle, also face a stark choice: facilitate a Chinese evacuation to maintain Beijing's goodwill, or cooperate with U.S. seizure operations to secure American backing for a successor government. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. It is February 2026. Cuba's regime is teetering on the brink of economic collapse, with the peso plummeting 10% in just 3 weeks. Oil supplies have been terminated following the capture of Maduro, and new Trump tariffs target any country selling petroleum to Havana. China currently operates 4 active signal intelligence facilities on the island, all of which are identifiable through satellite imagery. The U.S. military has surged 11,000 troops into the region. This situation embodies the Lord's Protocol, a high-stakes race to secure or destroy surveillance infrastructure before it can change hands. It's a crisis scenario where Cold War precedents clash with 21st-century great power competition. Let's examine what the technical evidence actually shows. We begin with Bajukal, the largest active Cuban signal intelligence complex documented by satellite analysis. Notably, during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, nearby sites housed Soviet nuclear weapons. For decades, Bajukal has been mentioned in congressional testimony, unclassified government documents, and Spanish-language media reports. Senator Marco Rubio, for instance, publicly called on Havana to expel this Chinese listening station during the 2016 presidential debates. Satellite imagery from March 2024 revealed significant infrastructure updates at the site. Entrances to an underground facility are clearly visible on the southern perimeter, with construction dating between 2010 and 2019. A new radome, added in March 2024, potentially conceals advanced radar or electronic intelligence systems. However, the most critical development occurred in April 2025. Analysts documented the construction of a new circularly disposed antenna array, CDAA, on Bajukal's northern perimeter. This array features 19 antennas arranged in a 175-meter diameter circle, replacing previous arrays of 16 antennas spanning just 85 meters. CDAAs are not typical telecommunications infrastructure. They are specialized signal intelligence collection tools designed for high-frequency direction finding, capable of pinpointing the origin of radio signals from 3,000 to 8,000 miles away. That diameter is crucial. A larger circle signifies greater precision in tracking signals over extended ranges. Bajukal's new CDAA provides the capability to monitor air and maritime activity across U.S. territory, tracking signals from Florida military installations just 90 miles north, and even 500 miles southeast near El Salo. Satellite imagery also identified a previously unreported facility at El Salo. When the Center for Strategic and International Studies, SISE, analyzed 2,900 kilometers of satellite coverage, they discovered a large CDA under construction, beginning in 2021, with a projected diameter of 130 to 200 meters. As of April 2025, work at El Salo had largely ceased, with graded areas within the CDA's rings being reclaimed by vegetation. Yet, its proximity to the Moncada cement plant, inaugurated in 2018 as part of a Chinese-financed cement industry revitalization, suggests a logistical connection. Social media photographs even show Moncada workers involved at the El Salo site. Once completed, this facility will be capable of monitoring U.S. Navy operations throughout the Caribbean and potentially the South Atlantic. 10 kilometers north of Bajukal lies Waj. This site features security fencing, 2 guard posts, and has seen gradual expansion over 20 years. From a single antenna in 2002, it grew to 12 antennas of varying sizes by 2025, alongside operations facilities and a solar farm, providing insurance against Cuba's notoriously unreliable electrical grid. The absence of visible dish antennas suggests a focus on terrestrial signal interception rather than satellite communications collection. Nearby, the Calabazar complex hosts a dozen dish antennas and 2 pole antenna arrays. Their number, location, and orientation have shifted considerably over time, adapting to an evolving mission. The newest dish antenna was installed in 2016, indicating continued modernization. These 4 facilities are strategically located, with some less than 100 miles south of Florida. This geographic advantage fundamentally explains their persistence. Signal intelligence transmission, particularly for line-of-sight radar, benefits immensely from Cuba's elevated island position, which overlooks populated American coastlines. Radio signals become increasingly difficult to isolate over long distances. Cuba commands critical approaches to the Panama Canal, key Caribbean sea lanes, and South Atlantic routes, while also overseeing approximately 20 vital Florida military installations. These include Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, Kennedy Space Center, Central Command Headquarters, Southern Command Headquarters, Naval Air Station Pensacola, Tyndall Air Force Base, MacDill Air Force Base, and Kings Bay Submarine Base. What satellite imagery confirms unequivocally are the facility locations, CDAA specifications, construction timelines, antenna configurations, and the presence of underground facility entrances. What remains uncertain are specific collection targets, the precise number of Chinese personnel, exact data sharing protocols between Beijing and Havana, and the operational chain of command. However, technical characteristics reveal much. A 175-meter CDAA diameter equates to precision tracking at 3,000 to 8,000 miles. Satellite tracking capability for Kennedy and Cape Canaveral launches provides invaluable telemetry and flight path intelligence. Multiple antenna types across 4 facilities indicate a complex signal intelligence mission, encompassing satellite downlinks, radio traffic, and commercial communications. Now, let's trace how this surveillance network emerged and what Cold War precedent tells us about its potential conclusion. The Soviets established LURD in 1964, just 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Covering 28 square miles and staffed by 1,000 to 1,500 Russian engineers and military personnel, it was the largest Soviet electronic eavesdropping installation outside Soviet territory. For 37 years, LURD meticulously monitored all U.S. military and civilian geosynchronous communication satellites, intercepted White House communications, NASA and Air Force Cape Canaveral telemetry, financial wire services, and military communication links. Cuban Defense Minister Raul Castro claimed in 1993 that Russia obtained 75% of its military strategic information from LURD. Unprotected U.S. telephone communications were systematically intercepted, providing support for Russian economic espionage and identifying potential espionage recruits through personal information extraction. President Putin announced LURD closure in October 2001, presenting it domestically as an economizing measure intended to free Defense Ministry funding for military reform. Most observers, however, suggested Putin timed the announcement to support Russian U.S. rapprochement following the Kremlin's enlistment in Washington's campaign against terrorism. LURD had long been a friction point, with some U.S. lawmakers advocating for linking aid to Russia to the facility's closure. Havana reacted angrily, as Cuba charged Moscow approximately $200 million annually to rent the facility. The evacuation logistics established a crucial precedent. Dismantling began in January 2002 and was completed by month's end. 3 Antonov and 1 24 cargo transport aircraft were dispatched to return equipment to Russia. The An-124 has a maximum cargo capacity of approximately 150 tons, with cargo hold dimensions capable of accommodating major antenna systems, electrical generation equipment, control stations, and other technical infrastructure. The entire timeline for evacuation was approximately 30 days. Then came the gap. For 12 years, There was no overt Russian presence at Lourdes until July 2014, when Moscow and Havana reached an agreement to reopen the facility, finalized during Putin's visit. Russia notably forgave approximately 90% of Cuba's $32 billion debt. By 2023, the University of Informatic Sciences, located on the former Lourdes site, had become a hub for Russian intelligence personnel. What the Lourdes precedent reveals is a distinct facility life cycle pattern. Establishment, peak operation, closure for strategic reasons, evacuation logistics, a gap period, and subsequent reactivation under new geopolitical conditions. It demonstrates that surveillance infrastructure can survive regime changes, economic collapses, and superpower realignments. The geographic advantage, Cuba's position just 90 miles from Florida, creates an enduring collection value, regardless of which power operates the facilities. The Soviets built Lourdes, operated it for 37 years, evacuated it in 30 days, and returned 13 years later. Now, China has built 4 facilities with technical capabilities surpassing Cold War architecture. Rumors of Chinese involvement trace back to 1999, when China's Minister of Defense Chi Haoyan visited Cuba and met Raúl Castro. Media reports at the time suggested he negotiated access to former Soviet eavesdropping facilities, potentially including Lourdes itself. In June 2023, the Wall Street Journal reported that China had invested heavily in cash-strapped Cuba in exchange for signal intelligence facility access, and had negotiated an agreement to train Chinese military personnel on the island's northern side. The Biden administration later confirmed that Chinese operatives had operated an intelligence facility for some time, which was upgraded in 2019. The administration characterized reports of China building the base as not entirely accurate, leaving unclear how much PRC investment funded the 2019 upgrade versus the November 2023 debt restructuring credits. This fits into Project 141, a classified military logistics support network aiming for at least 5 overseas bases and 10 logistical support sites by 2030. Pentagon analysis indicates the PLA is already clearly making use of newly constructed facilities, even when incomplete. The geographic focus is on securing strategic choke points and sea lanes connecting mainland China to export markets and energy sources. Cuba's facilities provide unique capabilities unavailable from Chinese territory. Collecting data on U.S. rocket launches from Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Space Force Station offers privileged insight into flight paths and telemetry, information of keen interest as China strives to catch up to American space launch technology. The capability to intercept data delivered by U.S. satellites passing over highly sensitive military sites across the southern United States is also significant. Florida alone hosts the Cape Canaveral Complex, Central Command and Southern Command headquarters, and multiple submarine and military bases. Intercepting commercial communications flowing through vital economic centers provides access to a treasure trove of unencrypted commercial data, which is often less restricted by encryption than military communications. Even limited access to Cuban facilities gives China a far greater ability to monitor and communicate with its own space assets passing over the other side of the globe. China historically lacked ground stations in North America, and these Cuban installations close that strategic gap, becoming increasingly significant as China expands its satellite constellation for reconnaissance, early warning, and communication. Meanwhile, Chinese state-backed firms Huawei and ZTE, both blacklisted by the U.S. government over espionage risks, now form the backbone of Cuba's telecommunications infrastructure, providing 5G systems, routers, and networking equipment across the island. Frequent technical exchanges between Cuban and Chinese state-backed universities facilitate technology transfer, potentially providing cover for intelligence activities. China's 2017 national intelligence law explicitly requires even private firms to cooperate with state intelligence efforts, fundamentally undermining assumptions about the independence of nominally commercial entities. Cuba's dire economic circumstances, lacking resources for independent telecommunications development, create conditions where Beijing can leverage infrastructure to support signal intelligence collection. In summary, China has built 4 facilities surpassing the scale and technical sophistication of the Soviet Lourdes. Beijing has effectively embedded itself within Cuba's telecommunications infrastructure. Now, Russia's approach involves military signaling that is more symbolic than substantive, but still carries inherent escalation risks. On June 12, 2024, the nuclear-powered submarine K-561 Kazan, an 885M Yazanem-class vessel, arrived in Havana Harbor, accompanied by the frigate Admiral Gorshkov, a tug, and an auxiliary tanker. This marked the first formal Russian nuclear submarine visit to Cuba since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Kazan is a fourth-generation nuclear cruise missile submarine with a 13,800-ton submerged displacement, a maximum depth of 658 meters, and a crew of 64 officers and sailors. It features 8 missile silos with vertical launching systems capable of carrying up to 32 Onyx anti-ship missiles or 40-caliber cruise missiles, in addition to 10 533mm torpedo tubes. Caliber missiles boast ranges exceeding 1,000 nautical miles, offering long-range land attack capability against targets across U.S. territory. The very next day, June 13, 2024, the USS Helena, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine, arrived at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. Southern Command released a statement confirming the deployment, an unusual decision to disclose submarine movement. The timing sparked interpretations of a direct confrontation between U.S. and Russian nuclear submarines in the Caribbean for the first time since the Cold War's end. 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Stone, and HMCS Ville de Quebec, remained close behind the Russian vessels. The Pentagon, however, described the Russian naval activity as routine, stating it was not concerned by Russia's deployments which posed no direct threat to the United States. Officials from Cuba, Russia, and the U.S. emphasized that no nuclear weapons were deployed on the Kazan or Admiral Gorshkov. Yet, the strategic symbolism far exceeded any actual threat. Russia reasserted its presence in a traditional Caribbean sphere of influence, demonstrating its continued technical capability to operate advanced platforms despite the resource constraints imposed by the war in Ukraine. This conveyed to Washington that Moscow retains a capacity for strategic signaling and potential escalation. In October 2025, Russia's Federation Council ratified an intergovernmental agreement on military cooperation with Cuba, providing legal grounds to define bilateral military cooperation. While the document contains no operational details, pro-Kremlin commentators speculated about Moscow deploying hypersonics on Cuban soil. Russian analysts acknowledge such claims are primarily rhetorical, illustrating the Kremlin's use of strategic signaling to evoke Cold War imagery and pressure the U.S. through psychological escalation rather than actual deployment. Russia-Cuba cooperation largely remains transactional and symbolic rather than a sustained military commitment. In May 2025, Moscow pledged approximately $1 billion in investment in Cuba's economy, though implementation details remain vague. Cuba remains a key Russian foreign policy partner following the 2022 Ukraine invasion and subsequent Western isolation. Russian crude oil supplies provide a Cuban lifeline, and wheat supplies ameliorate its food security crisis. For Russia, Cuba offers a tangible demonstration of retained influence in the Western Hemisphere. What Russian signaling reveals is a prioritization of strategic messaging over operational commitment. Submarine deployments, military agreements, and investment pledges primarily serve to evoke Cold War imagery and signal to Washington that Moscow retains global reach. Actual capabilities are constrained by the Ukraine war's resource drain and blue water navy limitations. Nevertheless, even symbolic deployments of nuclear-capable submarines create escalation pathways if miscommunication or political miscalculation goes awry. Russia sends submarines to signal great power status. China builds signal intelligence facilities for actual intelligence collection. Both approaches converge in Cuba, and both create contingency scenarios requiring meticulous U.S. planning. Let's examine what happens if Cuba's regime falls and these facilities suddenly become accessible, or if they need to be destroyed before they change hands. Scenario 1. Rapid Chinese intelligence asset evacuation. The lured precedent, involving 3 and 124 heavy-lift aircraft over approximately 30 days for a single facility, offers a point of comparison. China now faces 4 facilities with more sophisticated equipment than the Cold War-era lured. The PLA Air Force operates the CNY-20 strategic transport aircraft, with a maximum payload of approximately 66 tons, compared to the IN-124's 150 tons. What needs extraction? CDAA systems, including 19 antennas at Beijing and the projected 130 to 200-meter array at El Salo. Contents of underground facilities. Redundant communication equipment across 4 locations. Control stations and electrical generation equipment. Critically, intelligence databases, collection logs, and communication archives. This implies multiple cargo sorties over an extended period, rather than a rapid extraction. Even with multiple Y-20s, evacuation would require weeks, assuming Cuban airspace remains accessible. Maritime evacuation presents its own challenges. The PLA Navy lacks purpose-built roll-on/roll-off cargo vessels of sufficient capacity. The sheer distance is a challenge. Approximately 13,000 kilometers via the Panama Canal or 16,000 kilometers around Cape Horn. Transit time would be 25 to 30 days, making extended maritime transit highly vulnerable to U.S. naval interdiction, as the U.S. maintains overwhelming maritime superiority throughout the region. When would China decide to evacuate? If the Cuban regime faces imminent collapse or if political circumstances shift dramatically toward U.S. alignment. The critical question is how much advanced warning there would be. A sudden military coup would provide minimal warning, mere hours to days. A prolonged deterioration, however, could potentially allow for weeks. Would a collapsing regime facilitate Chinese evacuation, or would it choose to cooperate with the U.S.? Scenario 2. Hostile U.S. facility seizure and sensitive site exploitation, SSE. Such an operation would require specialist teams. Signals intelligence exploitation specialists. Communication security analysts. Technical signals analysts. Damage assessment experts. The U.S. military has developed substantial expertise in these areas during operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Priority intelligence targets would include equipment in operational condition where feasible, intelligence databases and archives, preventing their destruction. Technical signals analysis hardware and software, collection logs indicating tasking and frequency selection, communication protocols coordinating with Chinese analysis centers, and organizational charts identifying operatives and Cuban collaborators. At Beijing, the largest complex, underground facilities are visible on the southern perimeter. These underground components may contain the most sensitive materials and would require breaching operations if entrances are secured or destroyed. El Salo, with construction largely ceased, is not fully operational but may contain invaluable construction plans and technical specifications. Waj and Calabazar, while smaller facilities, have 12-plus antennas, suggesting complex mission sets. Each would require a separate SSE team deployment. Time pressure would be immense, a race against scorched earth. If Chinese or Cuban operatives receive advanced warning, they would implement destruction protocols before U.S. forces arrive. Even hours of warning could allow for the demolition of most recoverable intelligence value. The U.S. would prioritize rapid seizure to minimize this destruction window, with helicopter-borne teams potentially reaching multiple facilities near simultaneously, operating from Guantanamo Bay. Scenario 3. Scorched earth protocols and equipment destruction protocols would target electromagnetic demolition and high explosives to destroy antenna systems, thermite destruction of electronic equipment and control systems, data destruction through incineration of document archives and magnetic media. Modern solid-state drives can be rendered unrecoverable through cryptographic key destruction, milliseconds, or physical destruction, minutes. Facility demolition using controlled explosives to demolish underground facilities and render above-ground structures non-operational. With advanced warning, days, systematic dismantling and destruction would be prioritized for thoroughness. Chinese personnel could evacuate most portable sensitive materials and destroy the remainder in place. With limited warning, hours, the focus would shift to data destruction, with demolition charges prepositioned on critical systems. With minimal warning, minutes, emergency cryptographic key destruction would be implemented, along with small arms fire into critical electronics and thermite grenades on server rooms. Under the doctrine of military necessity, 1977 Geneva Conventions, which prohibits certain scorched earth practices, military necessity still provides legal justification for destroying installations directly supporting military operations. Signal intelligence facilities directly support military operations, and destroying them before adversary seizure falls within accepted doctrine. Scenario 4. Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0 Nuclear Strategic Escalation ***. The June 2024 Kazan nuclear submarine deployment set a precedent, demonstrating Russia's capacity to project nuclear platforms into U.S. proximate waters. Both the Kazan and Admiral Gorshkov carry long-range strike capabilities. Caliber cruise missiles have a 1,000-plus nautical mile range, and both Caliber and Onyx missiles possess optional nuclear warhead capability. While Russian and Cuban officials emphasized no nuclear warheads were deployed, the technical capacity is not in question. Escalatory triggers could include U.S. military operations extending to Russian personnel at Cuban facilities, which could rapidly escalate into armed confrontation. Russian military reinforcement responding to U.S. regime change operations, potentially deploying additional naval assets as a demonstration. Miscalculation in a dense military environment. The June 2024 concentration 3 U.S. destroyers, multiple frigates, patrol aircraft, and a nuclear submarine versus a Russian nuclear submarine, frigate, and support vessels, even in peacetime, creates collision and misidentification risks. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis offers stark lessons. 13 days at the thermonuclear brink demonstrated how quickly surveillance infrastructure disputes in Cuba could escalate to an existential crisis. Soviet nuclear missile deployment triggered a U.S. naval blockade, nuclear bomber alert, and preparations for invasion. The crisis was resolved through back-channel negotiations. Soviet missile removal in exchange for a secret U.S. missile removal from Turkey. Key variables then included clear communication between Washington and Moscow, both leaderships prioritizing de-escalation, and a specific negotiated resolution. Variables that might not apply in 2026. Maduro's capture demonstrates the Trump administration's willingness to use military force for regime change in the hemisphere. No clear communication protocol currently exists for a facility seizure scenario. Russian military limitations make a negotiated resolution less obvious. Chinese involvement adds a third great power, complicating bilateral resolution models. What might prevent Cuban Missile Crisis 2? Russian military limitations, as Moscow acknowledges its inability to contest U.S. dominance in the Caribbean. Chinese calculations, as Beijing prioritizes avoiding direct confrontation. Trump administration ambiguity, which alternates between Cuba ready-to-fall rhetoric and "I think we're going to make a deal" statements. What makes escalation more likely than in 1962? Three great powers instead of a bilateral framework. The operational tempo of a facility seizure compresses timelines compared to the 1962 blockade. The absence of a clear negotiation framework for three-way facility removal coordination. These four scenarios, each with different timelines and escalation risks, are all grounded in technical realities. Y-20 payload capacities, SSE team requirements, scorched earth demolition protocols, submarine standoff precedents, and the enduring geographic advantages. The consistent factor, from the Soviet lured to China's four-facility network and Russian reactivation, is the exploitation of the same fundamental reality. Cuba sits 90 miles south of Florida, with elevated positions commanding sightlines to major U.S. military concentrations. This technical advantage is unavailable elsewhere. China cannot replicate Florida space launch telemetry collection from Chinese territory, nor can Russia monitor Central Command and Southern Command headquarters from Vladivostok. Each power makes a dependency calculation. China's assessment * Cuban signal intelligence access closes a strategic gap in North American coverage. The intelligence value justifies the political risk of U.S. reaction, and economic investment despite Cuban regime instability. Contingency planning for potential facility loss is in place. Russia's assessment **: a Cuban presence demonstrates retained great power status. This symbolic value justifies limited economic support, occasional naval deployments, and intelligence cooperation renewal. Cuba's assessment **: hosting Chinese and Russian facilities provides regime survival support through economic assistance, diplomatic protection, and a demonstration of alternatives to U.S. alignment. Why do escalation risks not prevent facility expansion? It's a matter of rational risk acceptance. Each power conducts a cost-benefit analysis, concluding that the intelligence and strategic value exceed the escalation risks. Historical precedent provides normalization. Lourdes operated for 37 years without triggering a U.S. military seizure. Incremental expansion, rather than sudden deployment, also plays a role. Chinese facility construction occurred gradually from 2019 to 2025, avoiding a sudden revelation that might have caused immediate crisis. The facility life cycle pattern, establishment, peak operation, potential closure and evacuation, a gap period and reactivation, underscores this. Why surveillance infrastructure survives regime changes is also clear. Physical facilities represent a significant sunk investment, geographic advantage persists regardless of the operator, and technical capabilities retain value across geopolitical contexts. The precedent for return, demonstrated by Russia's Lourdes reactivation 12 years after its closure, shows that even complete facility evacuation does not permanently eliminate a surveillance presence. What do these contingency scenarios reveal? Evacuation logistics as a strategic vulnerability * China's lack of heavy lift capacity matching N-124 specifications and the vulnerability of maritime transit to U.S. interdiction, coupled with a multi-week extraction timeline, expose a fundamental asymmetry. Scorched earth as an equalizer * despite U.S. military superiority, Chinese and Cuban destruction protocols can deny intelligence value even if U.S. forces physically seize facilities. Nuclear escalation as a persistent background risk * the presence of nuclear-capable submarines during a crisis creates inherent escalation pathways. This isn't about debating whether China should operate signal intelligence facilities 90 miles from Florida. It's about documenting how surveillance architecture, which everyone knows produces escalatory risks, evacuation races, facility seizure scenarios, and potential nuclear brinkmanship, keeps getting expanded by powers claiming strategic necessity. The pattern repeats because geographic advantage persists, intelligence value justifies political risk, and precedent normalizes arrangements that would seem intolerable if proposed afresh. We have documented 4 active signal intelligence facilities at specific locations, with technical specifications derived from satellite imagery, including CDAA diameters and antenna counts, as well as underground facilities and construction timelines. These facilities offer collection capabilities with a 3,000 to 8,000-mile signal tracking range and satellite downlink interception coverage of approximately 20 Florida military installations. The historical precedent includes the 37-year Lourdes operation, its 2002 evacuation, a 12-year gap, and its 2014 reactivation. This is coupled with Chinese expansion following a Project 141 template and Russian symbolic signaling through nuclear submarine deployments. All contingency scenarios are grounded in technical realities. The persistence puzzle is answered. Why does surveillance infrastructure keep getting expanded despite escalation risks? Because each power calculates that the intelligence value exceeds the risks. Geographic advantage creates enduring collection value, historical precedent normalizes risk, and incremental expansion avoids sudden crisis thresholds. Why does infrastructure survive regime changes? Because physical installations represent a sunk investment that retains value across geopolitical contexts. Positional advantage persists regardless of the operator, and precedent demonstrates that even complete evacuation doesn't permanently eliminate a surveillance presence. What makes 2026 different? 3 great powers are involved instead of a bilateral competition. The operational tempo compresses timelines. Cuban regime instability creates facility control uncertainty, and there is an absence of a clear negotiation protocol. As of February 2026, the regime faces economic collapse. The U.S. has surged 11,000 troops, and Chinese facilities remain operational but vulnerable. The Lord's Protocol, the race to secure or destroy surveillance infrastructure before it changes hands, involves competing timelines. By March or April 2026, we will know whether the regime survived, negotiated a transition, or collapsed into chaos. We will know whether Chinese facilities remained operational, were evacuated intact, underwent scorched earth destruction, or were seized with recoverable intelligence. SI's satellite imagery from April 2025 showed Bajukal CDA construction ongoing, El Salo construction largely ceased but infrastructure intact, and Waj and Calabazar operational with recent modernization. What we determine versus what remains uncertain. Facility locations, technical specifications, and construction timelines are confirmed. Personnel numbers, specific targets, and data sharing protocols remain uncertain. What technical characteristics reveal is that these are not mere telecommunications infrastructure, but high-frequency direction-finding systems optimized for tracking signals across thousands of miles. The verdict: surveillance architecture that everyone knows produces escalatory risks keeps getting expanded by powers claiming strategic necessity. Cuba has become a focal point where Cold War surveillance architecture, post-Soviet intelligence collapse, and 21st-century great power competition converge. Not because any power planned that convergence, but because 90 miles south of Florida remains the optimal position for monitoring what happens 90 miles north. By the time you're watching this, the countdown status may have changed. But whether China evacuates, the U.S. seizes facilities, or the regime survives another crisis, the fundamental pattern, surveillance infrastructure's persistence despite everyone acknowledging where it leads, will remain. That's the Lord's Protocol. That's the puzzle that doesn't get solved, only reset for the next cycle. It's February 2026. 4 signal intelligence facilities are operational. The regime countdown continues. The race to secure China's spy bases hasn't started yet. But the contingency timelines are already running. The verdict's still out. But the technical specifications, the evacuation logistics, the facility seizure protocols, the nuclear escalation pathways, those aren't speculation. They're documentation. And documentation is what this channel does.